I'll yield the floor to our speaker and our moderator.
Well, thank you. Welcome, students, maybe some faculty, some outside guests as well. So Will has mentioned some of, and I call him Elliott because he's a not only former boss of mine, actually, but also a friend. So I'm not going to get into the formal part of it. He has a distinguished career. He's moved around in government and in the private sector as well, with think tanks, written several books, writes articles. But I just want to give a personal note to this. So Ronald Reagan comes into office. State Department is scared out of their wits because Ronald Reagan has this image. They think that Ronald Reagan doesn't respect the State Department, thinks we're a bunch of wimps that are career people, that he has to rule through his political appointees. And you know the difference between political appointees and career people. You know, the career people are either civil service or foreign service, and they move up in the government. State Department is staffed by mostly civil service and foreign service officers. So Ronald Reagan comes into office, calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. Well, I served in Moscow, and I certainly agreed with that. I haven't seen the ugly face of the Soviet Union at the time. In fact, now I'm thinking, watching what's going on, it's sort of that old Beatles song, Back in the USSR, because it seems as if a lot of things have turned now. But in any case, just to get to the personal side of this. So I was working in international organizations, and Mr. Abrams, Elliott Abrams, was appointed first to be Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. Big job, a lot of communications with our mission in New York and actually with other missions around, UN missions around the world, particularly Geneva, where you have a number of specialized agencies of the United Nations. Big job, a lot of meetings, particularly when the General Assembly in the fall is in progress. We're writing notes and speeches. The Security Council comes up, we're responsible for sending up cleared talking points and notes from the Department of State. So Elliott Abrams is the head of this. We started off with a little trepidation because I was a holdover from the last administration. And actually, we started getting along from the beginning, because what I found, and then later when he moved to the Human Rights Bureau, what they would call HA in the State Department, Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, a bureau for this. This is a functional bureau, so no particular regional focus. Although the focus in the Reagan administration was pretty much on the evil empire, I would say, really focused on that, on the Cold War. But in any case, so I was working for Elliott, and with a little bit of, not quite sure how this was going to work out, what they thought about career people. What I found, and I think for our students, it's really important, not prejudge people. Keep an open mind. This is what I found with Elliott. You could talk to Elliott in a way that he might not agree with, but he always took it into account. And, he's a controversial figure, I would say. I love controversy because, if you're blah all the time, you get there and maybe, in a class, you have a blah professor, what happens? Especially in the morning, right? After you've studied all night. So Elliott was an activist, knew what the job was, had goals in mind, goal-oriented, try to teach this at our School of Public Policy, remember national interests, remember goals. And he was one of those assistant secretaries who actually listened to contrary views. And you weren't punished for it, my goodness. So with this in mind, after his career, he's done a number of things in the human rights field with the Holocaust Museum, with a variety of groups, including one that's attached to Michigan itself. It's called the Vandenberg Foundation Coalition. Vandenberg Coalition. Senator Arthur Vandenberg, who made that statement. But politics stops at the water's edge, bipartisan. So, in any case, great deal of accomplishment. The topic today is national security and human rights. This is something, you've learned in political science. I teach it in my classes. How do you balance these so-called national security interests sometimes when promotion of human rights seems to be at odds with them? It's a difficult decision when you're doing policy. So with that, I'm really proud that Elliott came here. We've had some kind of Zoom sessions together. I remember him when he had hair and I didn't, because I haven't had hair since I graduated from the University of Michigan in 1960. It started thinning out, and I'm not sure what that says about the University of Michigan, or maybe it was my fraternity. By the way, one more point, just a personal point. I'm at the Ford School. You know that next to the Ford School is the Chabad. You know what the Chabad? It's a Jewish, what would you call it, sect or an yeah, I guess a sect. That was my fraternity house. Fraternity house, Pi Lambda Phi. Where the Ford School was the Sig-Ep house, which has now moved to what used to be the Phi Sigma Phi house. How did I get back to this school and end up next to my fraternity house where there was a certain amount of carousing? Those when you were young, you could do that. Doesn't last. Well, sometimes it does. In any case, it's a real honor for me to be able to introduce Elliott Abrams, who was both a colleague, a boss, and a very good friend all these years. Now, one more thing. You've heard of the neocons, right? Neoconservatives. So this is, if you read the magazine, the journal commentary, I'd say that was at least an expression of neoconservative thought. Many people have been quoted as making this statement. Even George Shultz, my former boss as Secretary of State. A neocon is a liberal mugged by reality. Mm-hmm. Not a bad description, actually. In any case, to talk about national security and human rights today, I'm very, very proud to introduce to you Elliott Abrams.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Levitsky. Thanks, Will. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and some, I guess, are zooming in. The topic is exactly what you described, human rights and foreign policy. So let's get into it. First, this was not a debate that was really had by anyone until Jimmy Carter. Modern human rights policy really starts with Jimmy Carter. Why? Because it's a reaction against Nixon and Kissinger. It's a reaction against their policy, which they would have described, I think accurately, as realpolitik, where human rights issues are, that's for children. That's for utopians. Let's get over that kind of nonsense. Example, in 1974, we have the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile. And we had a new ambassador down there then, I'm sure you remember David Popper. And he was sending cables in complaining about the human rights abuses in Chile at that time. And Kissinger sent these orders, quote, "Tell Popper to cut out the political science lectures," close quote. That was the attitude. And obviously Jimmy Carter reacted very strongly against that, created the Human Rights Bureau. It had not existed until the Carter administration. And he made it a theme of his foreign policy. But I'm not really going to pick on Carter too much, but a little bit. Because we need to talk about the question of what you might call hypocrisy, if you wanted to be mean. Jimmy Carter is elected in 76. So in 77, he becomes president, January 20th, 1977. His first New Year's, where is he? It's, December 31, 77, January 1st, 78. He's in Tehran with the Shah. I'll read you a few lines from Politico magazine. quote, "The President used the occasion of the state dinner given by the Shah in his honor to dub Iran, at the time a reliable US ally, an island of stability in one of the most troubled areas of the world." It's 1978. So a year later, it's a revolution, the Shah's gone. But here's Carter, an island of stability. I'm still reading from Politico. Clicking glasses with his host, Carter attributed the nation's purported solidity to the Shah's, quote, "great leadership," adding, this is Jimmy Carter, "This is a great tribute to you, Your Majesty, and to your leadership, and to the respect and the admiration and love which your people give to you." Okay, I give you that not to pick on Carter, but because it shows you something. Why would Jimmy Carter, the avatar of human rights policy, why would he say these things? It's complicated. We'll come back to that. Reagan beats Carter. And what to do about human rights policy was a big issue at the beginning of the Reagan administration. The first Secretary of State was under Reagan was Alexander Haig, who wanted to eliminate the Human Rights Bureau. This is all this Carter nonsense. We need to get over that stuff. But in the course of about a year, we did come up with a Reagan conservative Republican human rights policy. One part of it was anti-communism, but Reagan accepted the view that anti-communism was not enough. You had Jean Kirkpatrick as the UN ambassador. She had elaborated this theory of the totalitarian-authoritarian distinction, where we would work with right-wing dictators because communism was a different phenomenon. Reagan did what he said he would do. That is, he was anti-communist. He did work with the right-wing dictators, but he also worked hard to push them out. One example, Chun Doo-hwan in South Korea, who is persuaded by Reagan, who is hugged by Reagan, and in the hug is persuaded it's time to go. It's time for free election. Marcos in the Philippines, same thing. And that's when there's a free election, Marcos is gone. Same thing with Pinochet in Chile, same thing in Argentina, Uruguay, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. The credit goes to the people of those countries, but the United States was helping. That's actually a fairly controversial statement. I think a lot of people would disagree with it, but to me, it shows the problem. One of the problems of the human rights movement is it's become a kind of, unfortunately, too much of a left-wing movement to give any credit for people who are not in the left for having a human rights policy.
Oh, there.
In a way, very little has changed fundamentally, I would argue, in all of these decades. That was during the Cold War, now it's after the Cold War. Not changed in this sense. Human rights policy is an essential part of US foreign policy, and it is also a political football, and it is also a fascinating political science or theoretical question. I mean, the question is posed in the title that we had for this meeting. Can countries have human rights policies? Really? Without a lot of hypocrisy? Must not every country pursue its interests? What are those interests? I mean, military interests, security interests, technological, economic interests, financial interests, commercial interests. My argument is, yeah, every country is going to pursue its interests. No government anywhere is an NGO. You know, NGOs can be pure. The Committee to Protect Journalists, for example, is supposed to be about protecting journalists. Not supposed to ask, yes, but if you criticize that country, they might curtail purchases in the US, commercial related. No, they're there to protect journalists. There's no government on earth that can do that. Every government has to balance all of those interests. But my argument would be that supporting human rights is in the interests of and advances the interests of democratic countries, all democratic countries. It's true for Norway, and it's true for Canada, and it's true for Japan, and it's true for the United States. In fact, I would argue that an association with freedom, with the cause of liberty, is very much in the interest of the United States. Why? First, I said that the policy of Nixon and Kissinger was realpolitik. You deal with states as they are, forget the human rights nonsense. The problem with that argument is it only sees a black box called a state. So China is Xi Jinping, and Iran was the Shah. Now Iran is the supreme leader. Russia is Putin. But that's not realistic. Actually, that's not the way the world actually works. To see only the regime and not see the Iranian people, to see Xi Jinping and not see the Chinese people, to see Putin and not recognize that there are protests all over Russia against his Ukraine policy. People exist, and sometimes they even overthrow governments. I mean, that's what happened to Jimmy Carter a year later. So that kind of realpolitik isn't, I would argue, isn't very realistic. In fact, let me give you another example. Greece. Greece had a military dictatorship. This was the 70s. Nixon was president, and we were pretty sympathetic to the colonels who ran Greece pretty brutally, crushing democracy in Greece. For years and years and years, for decades after that, if you looked at a poll of what are the countries in Europe that are least pro-American, Greece was always near the top. Why? Because we didn't support them when they had a dictatorship, the people of Greece. And they remembered it. So again, realpolitik just not very realistic. Secondly, our alliances. We see this now with NATO in the context of Ukraine. Our alliances are, I think, one of our greatest strengths. And those alliances are not just based on security. They're also based on values. You think of Putin and Xi Jinping, they really don't have allies. I mean, they have each other. Is that an alliance, or is that a kind of combination for now of two murderers? It's not an alliance like NATO, where countries really do share common values. I'd argue that if you want to do a real realpolitik analysis, sort of hard thinking about what's in the interest of the United States, you end up with a human rights policy, because that's in the interest of the United States. The question being asked in the title here was compromise, balance, or overlap. Of course, the answer is yes, all of the above. Now, a human rights policy is very difficult to have, to implement. Again, government's not an NGO, you're always balancing. Therefore, consistency is impossible. You're not going to be able, the way I use the Committee to Protect Journalists, but whatever human rights group, they can be consistent. A government is always going to pull some punches. And there will, I mean, Carter on Iran is my example. There will be accusations of hypocrisy, and there will be hypocrisy. There will. In some cases, we will violate our principles because our interests are, or at least they appear to some officials to be, so great at that moment. Example today, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, you may have heard this, is not a democracy. Yet we have a relationship that goes back decades. When President Biden came in, he was really, really tough on Saudi Arabia, and he had made extremely critical comments about the Khashoggi case and about the Crown Prince who runs the place, Mohammed bin Salman, and he wouldn't talk to him. The president would not speak to him, though he was in fact running Saudi Arabia. But now it's 14 months later, and now we're cozying up to the Saudis for all the obvious reasons. For example, we want them to produce more oil right now. Venezuela. President had a very hard line on Venezuela, following the Trump line on Venezuela for a year. But about a month ago, 3 US officials went to Caracas. Why? And why then? oil. See if they could persuade the Venezuelans to produce more oil. Give you another example, Hungary and Poland, right-wing governments, which are very controversial in the EU over their, let's call it reductions or limitations on democracy. That's been going on for years, that huge debate in Europe. It's not happening right now. Ukraine. Poland has taken in, I don't know, 2 million Ukrainian refugees. So nobody's talking now about, yeah, but your Supreme Court, this or that. So that's just a fact of life. Another fact of life. In many cases, it's hard to know, it is difficult to know what's the right thing to do. Many of these situations are actually very complex. You have to watch out for that though, because complexity can be an excuse for inaction. And here's my second big example, and it's President Obama. I'll read you a paragraph from Fred Hoff. Who's Fred Hoff? Ambassador Fred Hoff was President Obama's special rep for Syria until he resigned in protest in September 2012. And Fred Hoff said, quote, Syria's complexity is the administration's last-ditch defense for an astounding 5-year bottom line. Not one single Syrian protected from the merciless, unrelenting, and deliberate campaign of mass homicide and collective punishment inflicted by the Assad regime against millions of Syrians. Obviously, I'm using two Democratic examples because I'm pushing against the notion that Democrats are solid on human rights and Republicans don't care. Did that quotation prove that Barack Obama was indifferent to human rights? Of course not. What it proved is that the Syrian case was a very difficult case. And even in his own administration, there were people who disagreed with his views sufficiently to resign and protest. There's a lot, in many of these cases, there's a lot of complexity. Sometimes the opposition to the dictatorship is very corrupt. Sometimes the opposition to the dictatorship is extremely left-wing or right-wing, and we don't actually believe that if they got power, they'd be much better. Or they would produce a democracy in place of the dictatorship that's in play. Sometimes it's complex because the situation just looks hopeless. So you wonder, is there any point in pressing human rights issues? I mean, there are a lot of examples, but take Tibet. I think Tibet should be an independent country, but it's not going to be an independent country. That's not happening. Given the power of China in the world today, it's a vain effort, certainly as long as China is ruled by the Communist Party. Some of the things, another reason is complex, we may be in favor of some things that in the country in question can be very controversial. Poland is a good example. Hungary is another good example. Gay rights. They're against gay rights. And it appears that that position is fairly popular in Poland and Hungary. So if we push it, how hard do we push it? And what do we lose if we associate the cause of democracy with what may be an unpopular cause? And that question. In a lot of cases, it's actually very hard, again, to know what can work. What can you do? Give you another example. Aung San Suu Kyi, Burma. She was the great heroine of democracy. And finally, the world, with a lot of American effort, pushed the generals to have an election, and she won it easily and was the democratically elected president of Burma. Burma has a Muslim minority called the Rohingya. She was completely indifferent to the persecution, including killing, of the Rohingya. She's our great human rights hero. But on that human rights issue, because it was not popular in Burma, it was terrible. Knowing how to push effectively varies, of course, from country to country, case to case, can be very hard. What's important in country X? What do you want to push first? You want to push elections first? Is it women's rights first? Is it religious freedom first? Is it persecuted minorities? I give you an example of Saudi Arabia, the Bush administration. It's an absolute monarchy. An absolute monarchy. That is, they don't even elect mayors, nothing. In some cases, you have a weak parliament. In some monarchies, they have nothing. So what did we do? I mean, do you just sort of say, well, forget it. We actually pushed religious freedom and we made some progress. They had the so-called religious police who would go around literally in the streets and the shopping centers and restaurants. And if a woman was not sufficiently covered, for example, if a man and woman were doing something terrible, like holding hands, they would literally whip you. They had whips. And the only religion really permitted was Sunni Islam. So we thought, okay, there's an open door here for a couple of reasons. One, the religious police must be unbelievably unpopular, right? I mean, including with the children of Saudi elites. Who's in those shopping centers and in those restaurants? Those people. So we thought we're pushing on a door that might just be a little bit open if we talk about the religious police. And on the religion question generally, you know, we said to them, you believe you're the country of Mecca. You are the head of the Islamic conference. You believe that everyone should worship God, right? Right. So why don't you let them worship God? Well, we let everyone worship God. They said, no, you don't. No, you don't. You know anything about Roman Catholicism? You need a priest. You need priests. You don't let priests into Saudi Arabia. It was literally true. They were not permitted to enter Saudi Arabia. So you're not permitting people to worship God there. You know, the argument's a good argument. And actually, we made some progress. There are other complexities. Monarchies. What do you do about monarchies? Not every monarchy is a vicious dictatorship, though they're not democracies fully. I mean, they are in Europe, obviously, constitutional monarchies. But what about Morocco, Kuwait, Jordan, Qatar, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia? I mean, it would be ludicrous, right, to go into the rulers of those countries and say, Your Highness, you need to abdicate. This monarchy thing is not working out. We don't believe in it. We're Americans. We believe in representative democracy. That's quite stupid. And it's not going to get you anywhere. So what can you say? And there are things you can say. For example, I mentioned, mayors before. Maybe you can say, okay, you don't want to have a parliament. Maybe people could elect mayors. And it doesn't threaten you directly. In some countries, there are actually real parliaments. Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco. The palace is still where the power really resides, but the parliaments are not without some power. But the question of monarchies is an interesting one. And I want to introduce a word here we may come back to: legitimacy. It is not true that a country is either democratic or the government's illegitimate. Monarchies, you remember the Arab Spring? And you were alive, but you weren't in college. It's about 10 years ago. No monarchy was overthrown. And I would argue that's largely because they had a certain amount of legitimacy. The dynasty ruling Morocco has been there for 400 years. So these are not illegitimate governments. There is also, to use the term you and I were discussing, what I've called performance legitimacy. If you live in the Emirates, you have a very efficient, effective government. Democracy, not in the slightest. But you are a lot richer than your grandfather was. The place looks great. If any of you ever have a chance to visit there, it's well governed. Not a democracy, but that's performance legitimacy. Singapore, much more democratic, but same sort of thing. Anyway, so what do you do in the case of monarchies? What do you do in the case of really terrible dictatorships? North Korea, China. Can you make any headway at all? In the Bush administration, the one thing we did do effectively on China was get some prisoners out of jail. Okay, I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to stop. The conclusion is obvious. Human rights policy, in my opinion, is always very complex and very difficult for any government to do because governments have to balance so many interests. But the conclusion to draw is not, well, then forget about it. The conclusion should be to keep working at it and to try to figure out what works best, what combination of official and unofficial activity, of carrots and sticks and lectures, and international cooperation among democracies can bring about human rights improvements, because in my view, the best way to advance US interests in the long run is to follow our own best traditions and our own best political values and try to promote the expansion of human rights around the world. Okay, I'll stop with that. And we're going to do questions and answers. Yeah, right, with questions anyway. We'll see.
But anyway, first. I guess since I worked for you for a while, I have earned.
Not very long.
And I know, but that's right. After, by the way, I worked for Elliott as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. I got a call from a different kind of Republican at the time, really more of a bedrock Republican, Ken Tomlinson, who said, would you come over and be the Deputy Director of the Voice of America, which I know very well from having served in the Soviet Union, because we were broadcasting, our charter was to broadcast real news. And we tried to figure out the mandate, which was to be objective. And also part of the mandate said, but to reflect the policies of the US government. So what we did is set up an editorial per day. Let the US government have an editorial that could be as hard charging as they wanted, translated into the 40 languages. I mean, and the editorial often hit on just this issue of human rights. So we gave the government their time, like sometimes the stations, have a break and they'll say, now a word from our directorship or something like that. Let me say one more thing about Mr. Abrams, about Elliott. When he was Assistant Secretary for International Organizations and we worked together, I was head of probably the biggest office there, UN Political Affairs, which dealt with Security Council issues. He wrote a memorandum about human rights, which I think is declassified at this point.
Yeah,
you can look it up. And the memorandum basically was what turned the Reagan administration into just, the evil empire, Soviet Union, that's all, into a more balanced policy. Didn't matter, the focus on the Soviet Union was still there, but it also said we had to have a credible policy across the board when you talked about Pinochet in Chile or other dictatorships, and express our values in certain ways, given, of course, some considerations that you just mentioned. It was and that's why actually I decided it would be good to leave the office that I had, which was a perfectly good one in international organizations, go work for Elliott as his deputy in the Human Rights Bureau. It was one of those, times when things changed. And words, this is what I try to teach in my classes, words, memos, persuasiveness, good arguments, logical, what I call logic train, carry the day. And so whatever you think about the Reagan administration, I know not everybody's supported, or those of you who didn't remember it too much may have in your mind something about Ronald Reagan. That policy held, and when I went over to the Bureau, we actually were quite well balanced, and we criticized in our human, you have by Congress legislated that we had to publish this huge human rights report on every country in the world every year. If you haven't seen it, you can look it up in the State Department saying it's a big one. And we tried to make it as as really factual and objective as we could. But anyway, with that, let me say also one thing about consistency that I always talk about with my class. There's an old expression, I never can remember who said it. Consistency is the hobgoblin of a small mind.
Emerson, maybe?
Could be somebody like that. So in any case, with that, I'm not going to pose the first question. Does whoever, yeah, please go ahead. And could you say something about just what you're studying in school? Give your name if you'd like to. It's up to you.
Planning on being a CS major. And my question really goes back to how you're introduced by Professor Litsky. A neocon is a liberal mugged by reality. And my question in particular is addressed to those who belong to the liberal school of foreign policy, particularly those who believe that supporting democracies around the world are always tantamount to US interests, more or less. During the Arab Spring, the United States government came out quite strongly in favor of the protests, and we saw in Tunisia that they elected an Islamist government, whereas in Egypt, they elected a government that was at best ambivalent towards the interests of the United States. And more recently, we saw in the case of India that much the chagrin of the United States, they haven't come out as strongly against Russia's invasion in Ukraine as you would expect. And if not, have even tacitly supported it by buying Russian oil and by private Indian citizens, often supporting the Russian government. So my question to you is, why do liberals necessarily always think that United States interests will always be supported by supporting? Do liberals believe that popular movements against authoritarian or unpopular governments in their home countries will always espouse liberal values or values compatible with their own? And if so, why did they come to that line of thinking?
I wish we had 2 hours because it's a complicated question. I think there is a view out there that I would call, there is a view that let's call realpolitik at one end, which is just forget about this stuff. Think about commerce and finance and security. But there is a kind of utopian view on the other side, that this is all very easy and you just support democracy and everything will be fine. There is also a school, I think, that would say, again, on that side, that we should always support democratically elected governments, no matter what they do. Why did they come to that view? I think it's a lack of realism, and it's very rare, I would say, in the government. I mean, it's more something you hear in NGOs and in universities, university faculties. Democrats and Republicans, for the most part, who are in the State Department or the National Security Council, just can't do that. I mean, because they have dealt with some of the examples you gave. I mean, what do you do about what is soon going to be, if it isn't already, the most populous country in the world, India, which has a democratically elected government, won a free election, won another election, and is veering away from democracy? And I think most people in the government, most people in foreign policy elite circles, as the saying goes, would say, oh, India's too important. You can't really criticize Modi. And that is a very interesting and very hard case for human rights policy. You gave the example of Egypt and the Arab Spring. Mubarak and Modi are not that far apart. Mubarak was a great ally of the United States. Hosni Mubarak, president of Egypt for 20 years, 30 years, sorry, 30 years. After the assassination of Sadat, he became president, ruled for 30 years. The United States was basically uncritical as he got older and older and more distant from the population and the repression grew, we just loved him. And he was overthrown. And one of the reasons was we didn't try to push him aside. He made a mistake that, by the way, Gaddafi made and that Assad made, which is to try to become a dynasty. Mubarak wanted his son to follow him as president. Mubarak was an Air Force general. His son had never spent a day in the military. And the military, which was really ruling the country, wasn't going to have it. It was obvious. We didn't do anything about it. So we ended up with Mubarak being overthrown and being replaced by free election, Muslim Brotherhood, which is also not democratic and was veering more and more away from democracy. There's no answer to your question, actually. I think it's just simply, it is a lack of realism and clarity of thought about the extremely difficult choices we're going to have in cases like that of friendly countries, allied countries, where you have a ruler who is moving the country away from democracy. How hard do you push? How loudly do you speak? That may not be an answer, but it's the best I can do. Thank you.
So sort of in the similar vein with that, the question.
I recognize you. You earned it. By the way, I want to say something about Will, by the way. Will's an unusual guy. He actually I said, you can't get into my class because you're an undergrad, right? So he said, can I come to your class? I said, you want to come to my class and participate in the discussion and everything? You're going to sit for, an hour and 20 and listen to the discussion. Will came to my class anyway, took time out of his, didn't get any credit for it. Interested in the subject matter, national security, drugs, crime, and terrorism, whatever it was. I commend this, and I don't want to, you'll blush. Well, maybe you won't. But I just, and it's also emblematic of the Alexander Hamilton Society, I think, too. The inquiry into, what's the guts of national interest? What's the guts of foreign policy? How do you make decisions? What are the opinions? That's Will's interest, and I commend him for it. So I think we should give him a hand as well. He's watching. Okay, go ahead.
Well, thank you for the humble introduction. So anyways, sort of in the similar vein to that, in your book, Realism and Democracy, very good work that you've done. You sort of mentioned the Islamist advantage in countries, in democratic countries in the Middle East, where sort of the more extremist Islamist factions consistently win in democratic elections in the short term, but later on they are and then they overshadow the more secular elements, the liberal elements of the voting base. You also mentioned some examples about Turkey, where the secular dictatorships sort of overthrow those religious extremists from taking power through coup d'etats or whatever they may be. But at the same time, there are cases such as in Egypt, where Mohamed Morsi, who's a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, was succeeded by current president Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, and he runs a very oppressive regime, has been purchasing a lot of weapons from the United States for its security. Would you say that the Islamist advantage will falter in cases like Egypt? And if so, how do you see that going forward? And how does that apply to the broader region of the Middle East? Thank you.
Again, it's a 2-hour question, but first, one of the things that we need to do is to know better the countries we're talking about. Turkey is a good example. Everybody I think this is fair to say, in the foreign policy elites in the US understood, what is Turkey? Turkey is a country of Ataturk. Turkey was the Muslim country that was most westernized, most pro-Western. Ataturk was a secularist. And so that's what Turks are. Wrong, wrong, wrong. It turns out that's what the military elite were, but all over Turkey, people didn't want to vote that way. In all the villages and towns and cities, people wanted to vote for a much more religious country, which is why Erdogan initially was winning elections. Now he's fixing elections, but initially he won fair and square. I'd make the same argument. What's India? Oh, everybody knew for decades. India is a country of Nehru and Gandhi and Mrs. Gandhi, secularists. No, Modi is winning elections with Hindu votes from people who are not secularists. So one of our problems, I think, and here we get to the Islamists, is knowing these societies better. Now, Egypt's a great case. The Islamists have a number of advantages. One of them is they haven't been, take Egypt under Mubarak, they haven't been in power. He suppressed them. He refused to allow them to have real power. He would make up his mind before an election for parliament. How many seats are we going to have the Muslim Brotherhood have? Let's say they can have 50. Let's say they can have 110. But they had no power because that was a small minority of the parliament. They had no power, therefore, they were not corrupt. No one would bribe them. They had no power versus the regime in power, totally corrupt. So if you're an Egyptian who wants better government, this looks like a new brush that can sweep the place clean. And they also have no record of suppression of human rights abuses. They do if you go back decades. They were a violent group. It's 4 years ago now. But if you're, under whatever it was, 6 years old at that time, you have no memory of the Muslim Brotherhood being violent. So you vote for them. It's also true that some people vote for them, I would say, on what you might call ideological or religious grounds. It's not just for good government. It's because they want a religious government. They want Sharia as the law of the land. That's not true in every case, but it is true in a number of countries. What happens when the Islamists take power? In Egypt, within a year of Morsi winning the election, the vast majority of Egyptians, there were pretty good polls, wanted him out. That was a popular coup, the Sisi coup. It was, it has led to a terrible dictatorship. Sisi is much more repressive and brutal than Mubarak ever was. But the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt totally misplayed its time in government. And when people like me said to Egyptians, you don't want a coup. You had a free election for the first time. You don't like him. In the next election, vote against him. And the Egyptians I talked to responded, there won't be a next election. He won't take the risk. The Brotherhood will never take the risk of losing power. They won a free election in Tunisia. Again, you had a dictatorship. The Muslim Brotherhood had been outlawed, and its leader, Ghannouchi, had been exiled, lived in London for 30 years. So corruption, not at all. Clean. They were going to bring democracy. They brought democracy, but the economy was totally stalled. For the average Tunisian, life got worse. I'd argue it's partly our fault for not giving enough aid, but so there was a sort of a coup now. Peaceful coup by the president of Tunisia. There's another case of the Islamists taking power legitimately in a free election and blowing it because they were not able to govern effectively. I don't think we've seen a case in which they took power and have then won I can't think of one, and then won a free election. Hamas in Gaza, they don't have elections. But there are opinion polls that suggest an awful lot of Gazans would vote against Hamas if there were a free election. So the advantage is partly, I think, never having had the responsibilities of power and the temptation of corruption. So when they get into power, it turns out they're actually not very good at governing. So people want them out, whether by coup or by election.
I just a comment. One of my interests is Brazil. I was ambassador there, and they have a party, the Workers' Party. You've heard of Lula. who was president of Brazil and probably may be again, given the record of the present regime. But one of the things that happened to the Workers' Party, it was always considered to be, they had a lot of mayors voted, but it was never actually in national, didn't have national power. They never won the election. The Brazilian elections, there are 20 some parties and you have to put coalitions together, et cetera. When they got into power, in a number of places, corruption corrupted the party, which is why you now have a very strange regime. I was going to say Trump-like regime, but I'm not going to get into politics in Brazil. So this whole idea, George Shultz used to say all the time, I think he quoted Bryce Harlow, trust is the coin of the realm. Trust is the coin of the realm. If a leader is not trusted or loses the trust, if in fact loses the trust is worse, then you've got a real problem in society and a real problem with democracy, I think. Anyway, that's enough for me. Please, yes. Yes.
Hi.
Yeah, just for
Or just, do you mind maybe if you stand up, that would be easy.
Hi, my name is Sarah DiStefano, and I'm a first-year Master of Public Policy candidate at the board school. So thanks for coming and joining us tonight. I guess my question sort of hits on, was it Fred Hoff, who's the ambassador from Syria, or to Syria rather? I know that your talk tonight drew mostly on diplomacy, but there's an example of where diplomacy essentially failed. And I'm assuming he resigned because of the red line in Syria, that we didn't have a military force go into Syria as a result of the human rights abuses that happened there. In light of everything going on in Ukraine, to what extent, what does the United States do when diplomacy fails in these instances? It seems to me that our global legitimacy on standing for human rights is compromised when we sort of cherry pick which human rights abuses we tackle with military force. Mm-hmm. And I certainly am not suggesting that we go into Ukraine with boots on the ground, but I do think it's a complicated issue. So could you speak to how you address, when diplomacy fails, when does the United States, what is the calculus there for determining what to do next?
I want you in my class next.
I actually think Fred Hoff resigned not just because of the red line, but more generally because of an unwillingness to do, he would say, to do anything. We get to the question of consistency and, when do you use which tool, what's the appropriate tool in a particular case? I think most people agree that generally speaking, you don't enforce human rights policy by invading countries and bombing them. Though, Bill Clinton did it in the Balkans. George H.W. Bush invaded Panama to get rid of General Noriega. Panama's been a democracy ever since. I mean, in some cases, you can point to an actual use of military force that works. I don't think you're going to be able to get out of this problem of accusations of hypocrisy and double standards. That's because we do have double standards. I mean, again, Tibet. How about using force to free Tibet? That's insanity, right? Yeah, I think it is insanity, but it's too bad. I mean, for the poor Tibetans. There are other cases where, Clinton and the Balkans was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so we were unopposed. How risky was it? It wasn't risky at all. Ukraine is riskier because of Putin. So you get compromises like, well, let's give them the tools, or rather, let's give them some of the tools, because we could give them MiGs. We're not giving them MiGs. I think it is fair to criticize those decisions. For example, should Obama have done more in Syria? Should Biden be doing more in Ukraine? But it's not fair to say, you know, Biden's making the wrong decision because he doesn't care about human rights and he's a damn hypocrite. No, I mean, he's making policy choices. We may agree or disagree, as Obama made policy choices. These were discussed and debated within these administrations. I'm sure there are people in the White House today who want the president to do more in Ukraine. So I would just say, you know, you have to start from the belief that America should be supporting democracy and human rights. And we have done a lot. Take the case of Ukraine. I mean, the sanctions on Russia are sanctions that were unthinkable 2 months ago. We're obviously shipping a lot of stuff to the Ukrainian military. You see some of it on TV, and I'm certain the CIA is doing a lot of other stuff that you don't see on TV. But we're always going to have double standards because situations are different. The risks will differ, and frankly, our interests will differ too. Here we're talking about the future of NATO. That's a big security interest. Panama, I mean, Bush did it, but it was much smaller case. Reagan did Grenada, a much smaller case. So I would say it's right. We always have double standards. That's not even an accusation. That's a description. I would say just be careful in making accusations because these are very tough choices.
Let me add something. Red lines have a specific meaning in the Middle East. So if you draw a red line and then have it violated and you do nothing about it, you've hurt not only your policy in the Middle East, you've hurt your policy internationally.
Yeah.
Because you can't be trusted when you say, and then you draw a red line and then you say, well, I got to consult Congress and I want to listen to what the Russians have to say. When you make a statement like that, which is a real, I mean, this is a red line.
Yeah.
You better be willing to carry it out. In fact, if the red line is crossed.
I want to tell you a story about that. 2005, we're in the middle of the Central America wars. Russia and Cuba are backing the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And we have photos from U-2s showing that the Sandinistas are building in a couple of military airports what are called revetments for MiG combat jets. Soviet Union would put MiG combat jets in Nicaragua on the mainland of North America. So we thought, well, we can't permit that. And we had a National Security Council meeting at which the question that was discussed was, should we tell the Russians that's not acceptable? Basically, you put them in, we'll take them out. I was happily the person who got to sit down with, as Assistant Secretary for Latin America, with my Russian counterpart and tell them, you put them in, we'll take them out. At that National Security Council meeting, everybody around the table, President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of, agreed, we're not going to accept it. And then Jim Baker, who was at that point, 2005, Chief of Staff, maybe, White House Chief of Staff, Secretary of the Treasury, maybe Treasury Secretary.
I think he was Treasury.
Whatever he was around the table. And Jim Baker said, okay.
Later Secretary of State.
Yes, under George H.W.
Right.
Bush. Jim Baker said, hold on, just a minute. I agree with this. I agree with this. This is what we should say to the Russians. But the decision to do it, to take those MiGs out if they're put in, is being made today. If we're making this threat to the Russians, we can't revisit this 6 months from now if they put the MiGs in. We can't have this discussion and people are going to say, well, I don't know, we can't. No. The United States doesn't bluff. We're making the decision today. If you're voting yes, if you're advising the president, today's the day we're making that decision. Because again, the United States can't bluff. If you're drawing a red line, man, you've got to be ready to enforce it.
given that this is, we are almost out of time here, we're gonna take two more questions.
There are two hands, I see.
Okay, two hands.
One in back of the other. First,
Right.
the young lady here and then the one in back. Is that okay?
Yeah, and we'll take two questions at the same time and,
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Do you want to both, go ahead in whatever order. Gentlemen first.
Jason Selden, freshman economics student. So what do you make of Milton Friedman's notion that economic development and prosperity leads to an increase in democratization? And just the recent case with China, and given their authoritarian lens, Xi increasing his own power, sort of refute that notion that he made 50 years ago.
We can take the other one now, or?
yeah, the other one.
Hi, I'm a freshman in LSI studying international studies and Middle Eastern studies. My question is kind of a large one, so take it or leave it. But how do we untie human rights from democracy? Do they have to always be tied hand in hand? You've been talking this evening a lot about how we can't necessarily ask that countries have full votes and full rights and full democracy. It's not, we haven't really made that happen in a lot of countries of late, post-Cold War. So how do we settle in human rights?
They're both really great questions. First, yes, I think we have refuted the notion that economic development leads to democracy. Xi Jinping, China, great example of this. Now, if the Communist Party, the CCP is overthrown in 5 years, then we may look back and say, well, actually, Pinochet in Chile, great economic development. There came a point at which the people of Chile said, well, we want democracy. We're very happy to have more income, but we want democracy. South Korea, huge, amazing economic development under the generals, under the military dictatorship. And then there came a point at which South Koreans wanted more. They wanted freedom. Cultures differ, I think, on the speed with which they get there. And it's also true that you can be very poor and free. And the example I would give you is India, which getting richer now, but I'm talking about India in the last, well, since independence. India was a democratic country except for a brief period under Mrs. Gandhi. Very, very poor, hundreds of millions of poor people who sustained a democracy. So the relationship is clearly not a direct relationship between economic development and freedom. Or as we used to say, no country is too poor to be free. Second question, it's a very good point, because another way of saying what I was talking about with monarchies is this: maybe you can't get democracy, or maybe you can't get democracy for a long time. Can you get some human rights progress nevertheless? Countries, even non-democratic countries, vary enormously in the degree of repression. Jordan, not a very repressive place. King runs it, but boy, I'd much rather live in Jordan than in El-Sisi's Egypt. There are a lot of imperfect democracies. I mean, ours is an imperfect democracy, but there are a lot more imperfect democracies. So yeah, one of the things you're doing, I think, in those cases,
Out of time.
the example I used of Bush and China,
Maybe make a comment.
there's nothing we could do to make it more democratic, but maybe we could get some political prisoners out of prison or out of the country. In the case of Saudi Arabia, maybe we can get political freedom, hopeless, maybe some religious freedom. If you look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which about 150 countries have signed up to, it's the whole list. They're all, these countries are committed, and many are huge violators, but you can try to pick and choose. I mentioned the election of mayors. Okay, that's a little injection of electoral democracy, even in a system that is undemocratic. Maybe you can get some kind of parliament, even if it's not a real full parliament, but that's process. On the human rights part, yeah, I mean, can you get less abuses? But I'll give you an example. Turkey under the generals. Now I'm talking about the 1980s, when Turkey there had been a military coup, generals were pretty rough, a lot of torture. I made the argument to the generals because I thought it was true. You're not torturing people. You know who's torturing people? The police. All over the country. They arrest people. How do they get a confession? They beat it out of them. They torture them into confessing. That's backward. That's primitive. That's medieval. You're not doing that in the military. You're modern. Not completely true, obviously, but so we need to work together to modernize the Turkish police so that they're modern and they have technology and they stop this stuff, which, by the way, was the way American police were operating until, around 1960. So that was a human rights improvement, nothing to do with democracy. So again, I think it's a very good question. And sometimes many times you look at a situation and you say, well, what's realistic? What can we do? We cannot democratize this country. The people of the country will do that. Maybe it takes 10 years, maybe it takes 50 years. But surely there are ways to have some human rights progress. And that gets to those very complex questions about, okay, what's doable? And what can we do? Because after all, we don't live there. We're outsiders and we're using relatively weak tools unless we're invading, which we never are for these purposes, really. We did not invade Grenada basically for human rights. It was basically so that it did not become a Cuban and Russian ally. We certainly did not invade Iraq for human rights reasons. We did it because we thought they had a nuclear program. But we're using weak tools like voting against them in the international financial institutions. But there are usually things that you can do because not everything is a matter of survival for the regime. And you can say to them, this is going to improve your reputation a lot. You should really do this. One of the criticisms of Reagan and other American governments is you're not critical enough and you're too close to that dictatorship. But that's how you get them to do stuff. If they believe that what you're proposing is a secret way of subverting them, undermining them, and trying to kick them out of power, they will reject everything you say. If you say to them, look, we're friends, we're allies, we wish you well. We're also Democrats. So we don't love the kind of government you have. But you would make it a lot easier for this alliance to exist. You do a lot better in Congress and in the US press and with the human rights groups. If you would consider trying A and trying B and trying C, it's not suicide. It'll help you actually. Sometimes people say drop dead and other times they actually try it. Thanks.
I know we're getting
Yeah.
the end, but a couple of just examples from my own experience. Henry Kissinger, I don't think was considered to be a strong advocate of human rights. But every time he went to Moscow during the detente period in the Nixon administration, he carried a representation list of people that were barred from reuniting with their families. And because we had, if you remember the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which tied freedom of immigration to trade with most favored nation status, which is called something different now. It's equal, whatever it was, they would get a lower tariff to import goods to the United States. He did that basically because of US public approval. In other words, the push of public groups, so-called lobbies, which sometimes have this kind of lobbies are bad, this lobby, that lobby. Actually, lobbies are part of the democratic system and they get their way sometimes. And you know what happened as a result of that, of those representation lists and the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, is we started getting Soviet Jews out of the Soviet Union, 20,000 per year at a time, finally up to the point of almost freedom of immigration if they wanted to leave and either go to Israel or some of them came to the United States. So the example of using, as you said, example of using a set of national security interests to promote human rights interests. That was my example because I was on the Soviet desk at the time. Every time Kissinger went, we gave him a list. We said, here are some very well-known dissidents that are Jewish dissidents that are being precluded. They lost, they were physicists, they lost their jobs, and then they were considered to be vagrants because they didn't have a job, sort of Orwell again here. And that actually happened. I think what was important about your time and the memo that you wrote, by the way, was to show that actually in what looked like hopeless cases, you could use national interests, straight national interests, Morgenthau kind of national interest to promote values. And, and that's been, I think it's been the case with every administration, at least modern day administration. Human rights always became some kind of component. It wasn't, Jimmy Carter raised it to the top, and we did human rights reports during that time. I remember writing the one on Soviet Union when I was in the Soviet desk. So it's not as if, right wing, left wing, whatever you want to call it, the component of human rights and national security is going to be there no matter what. Don't you think that's the case in terms of politics, especially?
Yep.
Yep. You want to close it out?
Yeah, sure. So thank you to both the Honorable Elliott Abrams as well as our moderator, Ambassador Levitsky. So please give a round of applause. So yeah, thank you guys for coming and have a good evening, everyone.